Guys, welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our SwiftUI tutorial series, and in this particular tutorial we are going to be taking a look again at network requests, but instead of retrieving data from the server using what's called a GET request, we are going to be using POST requests to send a network request from our application to an API to create a record in our database. Now, in this video, we're only going to show how you can add a project to the database using my simple Vapor Web API web service thing, which the GitHub repo link is in the description. But the endpoint for creating a bug report is identical to the one for projects, except you replace projects with bugs, and pretty much that's all there is to it. Every other concept here will apply to every single post network request you send for any service that you use. Whether it be a custom one or an in-house solution or something like that, sending post requests is pretty simple. And if you follow this video and you understand the concepts that I'll be showing you, you'll be able to do it no problem. All right, so let's go ahead and go into our let's go ahead and actually take a look at what we have for our application right now. So in Xcode, what we have when we successfully build our application and we run it, it's just got to do its thing. All right. Okay, so I must not have the API running, so we'll run that here. Let's see. So we'll Swift run. Okay, there we go. All right, there we go. There we go. Now we have all of our projects, and then we can see all the bug reports associated with each project here. And so with that, you can also see in the sidebar here, I have a toolbar. And in this toolbar, we have an add button. When we click that button, what will happen is a sheet will show up like this, and we can enter the information for a new project. So we can say, hey, we want this project to be named something like, let's say butternut. And then we have a text field for whether or not the project is inactive. So if this is checked, the project will be closed. If this is not checked, it'll be an open project. All right. And then we have a create and cancel button. The create button does nothing right now, but when we hit cancel, the sheet will close. So what we want to make happen in this video is we want to have our create button go out to the API and add the new project as a new record in the database, dismiss the sheet, and then we're going to want to also add that project to our array of projects. Now, that is a little bit more complicated depending on how you structure your project. But it should be okay the way that we're going to do it here. So let's go ahead then. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually construct the method in our network manager to create this project. So let's go ahead and go into we want the navigator here in Xcode. And we'll say we want network manager. Okay. Okay. All right, so inside of our network manager class, what I'm going to do is at the bottom of our file, we're going to create that create project method. Now, if you're following along with this API, I want you to not only follow along with this, but my challenge for you at the end of this video is going to be relatively simple. But it will test your ability to fully understand what's happening here. I want you, when this video is over, write the method to create a bug report on the server instead of a project. All right? So that's what I want you to do. Let's go ahead. And at the bottom of our file, I'm going to create a new method. Now, this method is also going to be marked with async and throws. However, we aren't going to return anything from this method because there is nothing to return. So we will say func create project. Or we could also just say create and then pass it a project like this. Mark it as async and then tell it throws because we are going to be able to throw errors in this. And we will open that up. Instead of project, it should be project. There we go. All right. So here is our method stub. We're creating a function called create. This create method will take in a project object. And then this method is also going to be an asynchronous method, and it's going to be able to throw errors. Because there are a few places in this method when we do our work that can throw. So we have to mark this as throws. So when we call create, that call site has to handle that error. Or any potential errors, I should say. So inside of here, the first thing that we want to do is we need to create the URL that we want to send our request to, as with every network request we send. So we can do this again using a guard statement. Guard let URL equals URL string base URL. So we'll do string interpolation there. Base URL. If you aren't familiar with this class, go and with what we have so far anyway. Watch the previous video because I'm not going to go super in depth into everything because we covered it in the previous video. I know it's almost a 50-minute long video, but we jam pack a lot of new concepts in there that you need to understand. All right? So, after our base URL, we need to pass it /bugs/create. Or not bugs. /projects/create. The endpoint for creating new bugs is pretty much HTTP localhost 8080/API/bugs/create. To do projects, it's /projects/create along with everything in base URL. All right. So once we have that, we want an else. So if something goes wrong, just return. Nothing should happen at that point. You could also have a print statement here to print to the console if something goes wrong, or if you want a custom error to be thrown for an invalid URL, you could do that as well. It really depends on what you want to do here. We're just simply going to return to keep it as simple as possible. All right. And once we've created our URL, we need to actually send that data to the server. However, before we do that, we need to configure the request. Now, why do we need to configure a request when we could just send the network request now? Well, the reason for that is because by default, the data method on URL session doesn't send a post request. The default is a get request. So we have to explicitly configure expressly configure a URL request object so URL session knows, oh, okay, we need a post request. We need this kind of content type, and we need to send this data as what's called what's called the method body to the server so it can handle it. Now, if that doesn't make any sense to you, let's kind of go over what a post request consists of, because that is kind of important. A post request doesn't retrieve data. Post requests are intended to send data to the server to create a new record or some kind of record or resource on the server. It's one of the 5 different HTTP methods that you can work with. Get, post, put, patch, and delete. My goodness, excuse me. Sorry about that, guys. I'm still slightly sick. But that's besides the point. So we have 5 different HTTP methods. Post is one of them. Get is another one. Get was relatively simple and pretty self-explanatory. You would retrieve data from the server. But post, you create something on the server when you send that request. So, in order for the server to know what it has to create, logically, you have to send some information along with the request. And that is where the HTTP request body comes in. Whereas the GET request doesn't have a body, the POST request, PUT requests, and PATCH requests do. Because the server needs to know what data to work with. In addition, we need to set the content type that we're sending over. Because we're going to be sending JSON data to the server from the client. We need to make sure that the server knows, hey, this is JSON data, treat it as JSON data. And we'll do that here as well. So, with that, being said, let's go ahead and configure that request. Go ahead and create a variable, not a constant, a variable. If you try to make this a constant, Xcode will yell at you. Var request equals URL request, and then URL request in its initializer needs to be given the URL that we want to send the request to. So just pass it URL like that. Next, we're going to configure the HTTP method. Now, to do that, we need to set the HTTP method property on the request. Now, this is going to be a simple string. And generally, HTTP methods are expressed in all caps, but if it's not in all caps, it's not the end of the world. It will still work. So to do that, you would say request.http method equals post. Now, HTTP method is an optional string. So all that optionality is handled internally to the object. We don't have to worry about it. But that is how we can set the HTTP method, by setting it to a string consisting of what method we're working with. In this case, post. All right. Next is the body. But we don't have anything to put in the body. So what we need to do, above our URL request, we need to actually encode our Swift object, our project that we got passed in, to some JSON data. So above our request, go ahead and create a JSON encoder object. In the previous video, we took a look at JSON decoder, which decodes JSON to Swift objects. Now, we want to send JSON data to the server, but Swift objects obviously aren't JSON. So we need to encode it to that format. And that is where this is precisely why we conformed to codable in our data models, because we need to be able to both decode and encode these objects. So just keep that in mind. If you're not familiar, if you don't know what codable is, go to the previous video. All right, so we'll say let encoder equals JSON encoder, like that. Now we are going to encode our project to some kind of JSON data. And this will be a Swift data object when it's all said and done. This encode method that we're going to call can fail. So we have to mark it with try. We can say let data equals encoder dot encode, and we want to pass it project. Now don't forget to mark it with try, like that. So let data equals try encoder dot encode project. And now that we have our data, after we define our HTTP method, we can say request dot HTTP body equals data. So we're attaching the data that we just encoded to our request. So when we send it, our server will receive that data and handle it appropriately. All right. So now that we have that, the last thing that we need to do is set the content type HTTP header to application/JSON. This header will tell the server, hey, this data I'm sending you in my body, this is JSON data. Handle it as if it's JSON. If you do not set the content type, this will not work because the server will not be able to determine what kind of data it is. All right. So, to set this header, we will say request.setValue Now, the first parameter is the value for our header. And in this case, it'll be a string. And it'll be application/JSON. Just like that. And then the second parameter is the name of the HTTP request header that this value should be associated with. And in this case, it'll be capital C content dash capital T type. And there we go. Now we have our request configured. The last thing that we need to do here is we need to send this request to the server and optionally handle the response code that we get back if that's what we need to do depending on what our application requires. We aren't going to handle a status code in the traditional way. Like, we're not going to throw any errors or anything like that if the status code is something other than 201. But we will print the status code when we get it back. So first things first, how do we send this request? Well, the same way that we would any other network request. So we'll say let, and then we'll use destructuring to get both the data and the response back. However, we don't need any data. So we will leave that property in our tuple as an underscore to say to Swift, ignore this, but we will get the response. So let and inside of parentheses, underscore, comma, response. Now this response object that we have here is going to be of type URL response, and this isn't going to contain a status code. We will need to cast this later to an HTTP URL response, and then we can get the status code. All right, so we'll set this equal to try await URL session dot shared dot data for URL request, so our request object, like that. So what this line is doing is we are sending our request to the URL that we've specified in our request object, and then when the server returns a response to the client, we are ignoring any potential data that gets sent back, and we are only interested in retrieving the response object from our response object from our API's response that it gives us. All right. Once that is finished, we can then parse our response, or rather we can cast our response to a HTTP URL response to retrieve the status code. So here we'll say guard let HTTP response equals response as HTTP URL response. And then if this doesn't work, we will simply return. If we were successful in unwrapping our cast to HTTP URL response, we can then retrieve the status code and test it. We'll say if HTTP response dot status code is equal to 201. Now, HTTP response 201 means that the resource or record was successfully created. There wasn't any problems. We can say print status status 201 creation successful, else we simply want to print status HTTP response status code creation failed. Like that. Now, if this was a real-world application, you would be doing something a little bit more involved, but this is fine for a tutorial example. If you want to completely skip handling the status code, you could, but I don't recommend it, because getting the status code and handling things based on what it is still a vital skill to have when sending and retrieving network requests and responses from an API. But that's it. That is all of our networking code for creating a new project. The next thing that we need to do is we need to actually call this code. So, what we're going to do here is inside of our, let's see here, inside of our little sheet, so add project view, we're going to create a method, and we'll call it func create project. We'll say async, like that. So this is going to be an asynchronous method. And inside of this method is where we're going to construct our project and then send it to the network, to create it on the server. We'll say let project equals project. Here we'll pass it a UUID. We'll give it a name. We'll pass whether or not it's closed. And then we'll give it an empty array of bugs. Now, make sure that that is empty, even though our API will ignore this property for for this model. Just leave it empty, and everything will work fine. Okay. Now we have our project object in Swift. Let's go ahead and say do, and then we'll catch any errors, and we'll print error dot loc. Okay. Okay, come on now. Print error localized description. Inside of our do block, we will simply say try await network manager shared dot create project. And there we go. And that should be it for this method. It's nothing too complicated. We don't have to update any state or anything like that. Now, inside of our code, where we have our create button, inside of its action method, or inside of its action closure, I should say, we will have a task. And inside of this task, we will say await create project. Now, why do we need to surround the call to create project in a task? Well, the reason why we need to do it that way is because the action closure of a button is not an asynchronous context. It can't call methods asynchronously, only synchronously. So in order to call the create project method, we have to wrap it in a task, which in turn wraps it in an asynchronous context. So we can use await there. And there we go. After that, I'm going to await create project. All right. And then after we have created the project, we will call dismiss, like that. So that way our sheet will dismiss after the project has been created. The last thing that we need to do is we need to reload our data. We need to actually reload our data in the sidebar. So what we'll do here is we'll find that sidebar view. So struct sidebar view. Let's find our sheet. We will add a closure here. And then this will be content. Well, okay. So what I want to do is find our sheet. Instead of what we have right now, we'll say dot sheet is presented. We want the version that has an on dismiss closure after the binding. So $is showing add project sheet. All right. We'll have that closure for on dismiss. And then we'll have a content closure like that. And the content closure will contain our add project view, while our on dismiss closure will contain a call to our method get projects, because we want to be able to refresh the projects in the sidebar. So we'll say task. This again has to be wrapped in a task because on dismiss does not execute asynchronous tasks. All we can do is kick off an asynchronous task inside of this closure using our little task thing here. Inside of the task, we simply want await get projects. Or rather, it should be retrieve projects. My apologies. And there we go. Okay, we want, let's see, make sure that everything's working fine here. Okay, so we have one small problem. And we need, apparently that state got removed, so we'll state private var is showing add project sheet bool equals false, just like that. All right, cool. And we are good to go. So now that we have all of that done, what we're going to do is we are going to run our code. And our build is successful. Let's go ahead and add a project. We'll call this bug or not. Project is inactive. I'll leave that unchecked, so it'll be open. And then we'll hit create. Once we've done that, you can see our sheet gets dismissed. And if we go through our list of projects, we get project 1, 2, 3, all the way down until at the very bottom, after project 25, we see bug or not. Precisely what we wanted to happen. So what happened here is we have all of our projects. We hit the plus button. When we hit the plus button, our sheet shows up. We enter all the necessary information. We hit create. The first thing it then does is it sends out that request to the server. The server fulfills that request, sends back everything we need in the response. We handle the response as necessary. Once all of that is done, we dismiss the sheet. And then once the sheet is dismissed, we call back to the server to retrieve a refreshed list of all of our projects. And then everything that we did in the previous video gets done. And boom, we get our refreshed list displayed to us with the new project all the way down there at the bottom. So with that, that pretty much does it for this video on how we can send post requests to a server to add records or resources. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.